So let's get started introducing our wonderful keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, who we are so honored to have here today and so excited to hear from. Dr. Wilson is president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, pursuing the vision of a nation where marginalized children flourish, leaders prioritize their well-being, and communities wield the power to ensure they thrive. Since 1973, Children's Defense Fund has been leading the movement to build power for child-centered public policy informed by racial equity and the lived experience of children and youth. From 2011 through 2020, Reverend Wilson was president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, a faith-based philanthropy for child well-being and racial justice in St. Louis. Under his leadership, Deaconess constructed and established the Deaconess Center for Child Well-Being, which is a community action think tank engaging more than 15,000 citizens annually. From 2008 to 2018, Reverend Wilson also pastored St. John's Church, an interracial inner-city congregation related to the United Church of Christ. Our staff are going to put Dr. Wilson's entire bio, a link to his bio in the chat, because we could be here for a very long time with me introducing Dr. Wilson and many amazing contributions he's made to our community and for our children and youth. But I will end with this, that Dr. Wilson has earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Xavier University of Louisiana, a Master of Divinity from the Eden Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry from Duke University. So he knows that there is a little tiny basketball game that's going to be happening this weekend. And we're not going to get into any rivalries during this webinar, I promise, Dr. Wilson, but we know that you're probably going to be watching some hoops this weekend, and we're glad that you are here. Dr. Wilson is married to Dr. LaToya Smith Wilson, a dentist and a child advocate, and they are raising 4 children together. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Dr. Wilson, who thank you so much for being here today, and we are so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. I am excited to be in, air quotes, North Carolina today. Glad to be in North Carolina physically later this week. And indeed, I am a partisan in this great debate of blues this week, but excited as all on this call for that little basketball game that you referred to that'll be happening this weekend. I'm inspired by the work that you all are doing at NC Child, for the coalitions that have come together, for the experiences and opportunities I've been having over the course of the last 16 to 17 months or so in seat here at the Children's Defense Fund, to be in community with the remarkable child advocates, organizers, and activists around child well-being in the state of North Carolina. And so it is indeed an honor and a blessing to be back with you in this setting and to be with many of you again as we have been in the past. I'd like to talk today in light of this theme as we bring greetings on behalf of the staff and here today from the offices of the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. Bring greetings on behalf of the staff, the volunteers, the board members, and those who serve as leaders across the country with the Children's Defense Fund, to each and every one of you. And I'd like to center my comments today on the concept of raising democracy, something we've been wrestling with significantly at the Children's Defense Fund. But I want to talk about raising democracy in light of your theme of empowered communities driving change. What I really want to do more than anything is open up a few provocations and sharing openly for a few moments, and then have the opportunity to enter into conversation with you to see how we might be about this business together. I ground myself this morning having made the drive into downtown Washington, D.C., into the district, having journeyed past the Washington Monument and the African American Museum, having turned left after stopping at a stoplight where I was able to view the Capitol. And with memory of the cold day Sunday when I went out to the tidal basin to experience the cherry blossoms with my family. that this week, as good as it is to wear blue in North Carolina, I am also lifted and enlightened by the imagery of Washington, D.C., which has become the iconic imagery of America, the National Mall, and these figures and these scenes that seem so uniquely patriotic that they tap or wire, record on our intuitive tapes a sensibility about the American identity. And I do so, having spent the last 20 years as a resident of the state of Missouri, who sent forth one of America's greatest poets, who came later to be identified with Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance. His name was Langston Hughes. He wrote a poem that I find helpful for my centering and grounding in conversation with you about raising democracy today. It was entitled, "Let America Be America Again." I'll lift a few stanzas of the poem in the interest of our conversation about inclusion and voice today. He begins this way, and I quote, "Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself can be free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream, the dreamer's dream. Let it be that great, strong land of love where kings never connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriot wreath. But opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws the veil across the stars?" So ends the quote and opening of the poem. Hughes, in this opening of this extended poem, which I invite you to read and reflect upon yourself, raises questions, but also frames critical elements of the American identity. He goes on to answer his question of who this is mumbling in the dark, who this is in this muted refrain that America never was America to me. He suggested maybe the poor white man fooled, crushed, and pushed apart, the Negro bearing slave scars. He suggests that it may be in his language, quote unquote, the red man driven from the land. He has all of these ideas of who this could be, who is engaging this muted refrain, who is troubling the idea of the aspiration of America by stating in parenthetical voice, America never was America to me. Who could this be? He did not make it this far, but I will muse with him for a moment and suggest this muted refrain in his articulation of these key elements of the American dream: civic participation, social mobility, idealistic aspiration. Who could this be with this veil across the stars? Could it be the 74 million marginalized voices of children across America? Could it be the 2.3 million whole human souls who do not have votes in the state of North Carolina, but will have to live with the impact of its public policy longer than anyone else? Could it be the 3,600 young people who lost caregivers in the context of a pandemic and now must find a next normal without the most loving hands that they have known? Could it be the 300,000 young people who risked slipping back into poverty because of the lack of congressional capacity to extend the child tax credit? Could it be 20% of North Carolina's children who live below the arbitrary line that we call poverty and rely deeply on the universal free school meals that we have afforded them over the course of the last 2 years, but will go away as they go this summer into their homes, away from the place where they might have gotten those meals? Who are you that mumbles in the dark. These may well be America's, North Carolina's children, expressing the parenthetical thorn of exclusion of marginalized voices in Langston Hughes' poem, and more importantly, in our communities across the country. But I have some sense of hope that we are often routinely reminded of muted and marginalized voices. Moments remind us of marginalized voices. Movements remind us of marginalized voices. And at our best, the mission of our social enterprises remind us of these marginalized voices with muted refrain. The dream, the mission, the aspiration that you articulate for child well-being, for civic participation, for social mobility, for collective identity with aspiration. In your collectives, America, do not include me. But every now and then, we hear again from these muted voices. Moments remind us. I moved to Washington, D.C. in December of 2020. I spent the first month trying to figure the lay of the land and then drove back to St. Louis, where I'd lived for some time, in order to be able to come back and bring a little home with me. My son, Dallas, 12 years old at the time, my artist and my empath, decided that because he was going to school virtually, he could go to school from anywhere. And that included coming to be with Dad in Washington, D.C. as he sought to get his bearings on this new job before the family could come out. And so on the weekend, the first weekend in January, there around the 2nd and 3rd, Dallas came to drive with me back to Washington, D.C. And so he was with me, beginning to settle in, moving things back and forth from a small apartment that I lived in by myself with a studio room to a little bit larger small apartment where we could live in together for a few months in the district. And as we were going back and forth, there was on that day, January 6th, on that day, a gathering at the Ellipse. And as we were going back and forth to move things in our new little apartment where we might live together, we stopped to watch the television. And as we stopped to watch the television, we heard tell there it's with the iconic elements of American society and the monuments behind them. We heard the strongest, the highest, the voice that is called to be the leader of the free world, calling people to the Capitol. And later that day, we watched together, me and my 12-year-old son watched in this unique an element of a moment where we saw the Capitol being attacked. Moments remind us of muted and marginalized voices. And as I looked over at my 12-year-old artist and empath who feels deeply all the things that are happening around him and have a sense of tensions that I sometimes miss, I saw him, scales falling from his eyes about the ideas that I had taught him about what was possible in America because that iconic building found itself under attack. Moments remind us of muted voices. My son, who does not talk a lot unless you talk to him. My son, who finds his joy in isolation and in artistry. My son, who paints the picture of what is in his heart and finds joy even in cartoons when he's as big and as tall as his father. My son became the center of my attention, and I remembered, it made me recall and reflect on this new role. The role that I had to move to Washington, D.C. to do, because we have dropped our bucket at the Children's Defense Fund with shifting public policy in the place that found itself under attack. And that moment reminded me of the muted voice of my son. That this idea, this concept of America, of aspiration, of social mobility that had tied with it the concept of civic participation we at the Children's Defense Fund decided the best way to get to child well-being was to go through that building where the American ideal of civic participation was lived out, and that building found itself under attack. If public policy would be the most sustainable way to ensure child well-being, and indeed the mechanisms by which we engage this public policy found themselves ground down like the Senate right now, where things can't seem to get done, or ground down by division and insurrection like I experienced in that moment with my son, then what will be of child well-being, and what will be of the hopes of this 12-year-old Black boy? Moments. We're reminded of the muted voices and the marginalized refrain in moments. Chip and Dan Heath wrote a book published a few years ago called The Power of Moments. There, they sought to avoid the use of an acronym that I will use for defining moments. They suggested that these moments can be epic. Defining moments are marked, they suggest, by one of these four elements. They are elevated. They're elevated because they rise above the everyday. They are marked with pride because they capture us at our very best, or insight because they rewire our understanding of ourselves and the world, and connection because these moments are social in nature. While, of course, they spoke of powerful, positive moments that give us the capacity for transformation in our time, I also believe that moments can be challenging and tragic, and they also bring us back because they remind us they are different from the everyday. They call us back to the best of ourselves, either because they invite us in or because we are repulsed by what we see, and we have to rethink insight the way we have gone about our business. We at the Children's Defense Fund decided that we had to go about our business differently. We read that that building would be tied up in the shifts of demographics that are causing people to engage and feel right now. And so our work has to be more grounded in places like Greensboro. It has to be more rooted in places like Raleigh. We must find ourselves more in places like Charlotte, because this is where the work of civic participation actually will happen. The aspiration of America that is required for the lived experience of child well-being is happening all across the country. And so we've got to spend less time with our focus on the hill and more time with our feet in the hills of Appalachia and in the streets of St. Louis, if America will be America again. We're reminded of these muted and marginalized voices by moments, but we're also reminded by movements. As was stated in the bio, I came to this work from St. Louis, Missouri. There was a moment some years ago, actually in 2013 and 2014, where I was preparing to mark the 125th anniversary of the mission, the Deaconess mission in St. Louis. St. Louis was preparing to celebrate its 250th birthday in 2014 as well. And so we were doing all the things that you're supposed to do when you have these, what you know will be significant moments. You prepare yourself to engage in reflective insight. At Deaconess, because our mission was tied to child well-being, we engaged in a partnership with Washington University, and we began to host over time a series of symposia and dialogical reflection with child advocates, whereby we might define child well-being for our community. You do understand, we talk very little about child well-being, flourishing, and thriving. You do recall that this is a new conversation for us. We spend more time speaking of the mitigation of risk, stopping negative things from happening, trying to protect children and trying to provide for children, less time considering their participation in the work. And so we set aside a space where we would celebrate by reflection, trying to create an epic moment of insight for us. We began to to bring people together around the concept of initiating a school to a cradle to career pipeline with all the ancillary supports for our community. We had the multi-sector networks pulled together based upon the best language from the Collective Impact Forum and the best research from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And we were convening people even at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis at the highest, most elevated places to have critical conversation for children. And we had decided that the work of 2014 would be this work at the Cradle to Career Initiative, bringing all the regional leaders together for this work. And on our way to the forum, as it were, on our way to our defining moment that we had decided in our from our philanthropic platforms and from our academic spaces and from the best of our social sector circles, we decided we would do this work. And in the middle of the year, Michael Brown Jr. was killed. An 18-year-old boy was killed in the middle of the street, and 18 and 19-year-olds came out to mourn him. And they decided that the agenda would be something else. They decided that we were going to focus on criminal justice, and we were wanting to focus on early child education. They decided that we were going to focus on municipal courts that were robbing and stripping wealth, even though we were trying to focus on what we would do to get people to college. They decided that we would focus on considering how the fragmented education system, by virtue of its segregational segmentation of Black and brown bodies from white bodies, would be the critical and central focus of our work and the most important thing that we did, while we were trying to suggest that we wanted to talk about a philanthropic strategy and approach to align our investments. When we listened to the young people, we had a totally different conversation. They decided that we could not determine the future of our children and our community in the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis because there was too much security and too many rails to go through and too many things to navigate, and they didn't have immediate access. Rather, we would have to decide in front of the police department in Ferguson, night after night for over a year. We'd have to decide in community forum spaces across the region, and we would have to decide, centering a dialogue about social mobility that had to do with access to assets, not just income. Seems like a hard shift, doesn't it? Child gets shot in the middle of the street. Young people go grieving and mourning. And we end up talking about economic mobility and access to resources in a way we hadn't before. This is the beauty of listening to the muted voices and the marginalized refrain. There is brilliance that we do not expect. And so while we wanted to have a conversation just about children and how we would align social sector supports, the children beginning at the point of their pain, the loss, and seeing the reality of their daily circumstances, interactions with systems that can literally cut down their lives, and their willingness to stand out in the middle of the street until someone gave them some answers. That led us to a broader community conversation, and the Ferguson Commission, operating over the course of a year, listened to more than thousands of community voices, mobilized thousands of volunteer hours in order to cast a vision for equity for the entire region. And in the center of that vision, critical to that vision, was centering children in public policy conversations. Central to that vision was making sure people had access to thrive economically. And a critical indicator for that, the children drove us to learn about the research of Ross Chetty, family economic mobility. They sent us back to a conversation about social mobility in the American dream. We began to study, we found that we were 42nd as a region, 42nd in economic mobility, the ability for one generation to do better than the last. And this was important for us, of course, because we were talking about this idea of the American dream, that if you defer gratification, get an education, and you work hard, then you can do better than your parents. And these who stood around Michael Brown's body were millennials, the most educated generation in American history. And because they were raising up, because they were being developed in the context of responses to an economic recession, the fissures, the fractures, and the disruptions, that we have seen over the course of the last 25 years of American life, they would actually not do as well as their parents. So this idea of economic mobility, that I heard when I was in February, I was in Charlotte, and I heard this has become critical to conversation in North Carolina as well. That Charlotte, Atlanta, and Chicago have been identified by Chetty as the most difficult places for a child to go from the lowest quintile to the highest quintile of economic standing in America. It is harder to live out the American dream for a child in Charlotte than a child almost anywhere else in the United States when we talk about this idea of social mobility. The children of Charlotte are saying, America never was America to me. They are the voices that mumble in the dark. And centering their conversation, it will be critical to us. And so I want to stop here because I want to get into conversation with you. I have said, though, I got to deliver on the promise. I've told you that moments remind us of the muted and marginalized voices. I've told you that movements remind us of the marginalized and muted refrain. It is also the case that our missions can remind us on a more regular basis. The question of mission, though, has to be answered by who's responsible. Who's responsible and who gets the mic? What we realized at the Children's Defense Fund was that we had to be more critical about making sure that people were responsible. Who's responsible for making sure community voice informs the programming and the platform of our advocacy? Who's responsible? The first question I asked for our public policy director when I got here is, who authorizes our public policy agenda? Unfortunately, we didn't have a good answer. I asked, when was the last time we went to community and asked them what should be on our public policy agenda? I asked, what was the process by which we gave authorization to our standings with public policy and our endorsement of bills? And I asked, who's accountable and who's responsible? And I'll just say I didn't get a sufficient answer. So I had to decide that I would be accountable, I would be responsible, because ultimately this is what fiduciary responsibility is about. Living the mission. And so I offer to you that who is responsible for getting community voice in your platforms, in your program, cannot be someone with the title of community engagement or community outreach. Who's responsible is not even the person who is in the CEO seat. Who's responsible is the board of directors. And the question becomes, does the board of directors reflect those who will hold this work accountable? Does it reflect the communities whom we say we serve? Ultimately, this issue of inclusion and the empowerment of communities cannot be lived out on our programmatic agendas alone, on our public policy agendas alone, but must be lived out at the board table. Did we build a board? This is the most critical question. Did we build a board that can help us raise money, or did we build a board that would do the work that the IRS calls them to, which is to hold us accountable to the mission and the standards of the community? And if they don't know the work, if they don't know the pain, and if they don't know the problems from their lived experience, are they the right people? I know this is the challenging piece, so this is where I'll stop. I want to suggest to you that those young people are the right voices. I want to say it in a voice that's stronger than mine. I began with this idea of the American dream, and so I'll close with a reflection on the same. There's a woman by the name of the Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall. And Dr. Hall is a name in the civil rights movement that does not echo in the same way as a John Lewis. It does not echo in the same way as a C.T. Vivian. It does not echo in the same way as a Martin Luther King, but she was the originator of the dream. Those who understand the story know that this Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee member, who was a field organizer in Southwest Georgia, was the one who originated the concept, the rhetorical refrain, "I have a dream." She was the one who Dr. King later heard say, "I have a dream," and called her back and asked, "Can I use that phrase?" So yes, every year we have a celebration of Prathia Hall without naming her when we celebrate the dream speech. But here we have Dr. Prathia Hall, who gathered with this idea, this concept of what the dream is and how we could live it out and who it should be accountable to. And in Tennessee in 1999, on the campus of Children's Defense Fund's Alex Haley Farm, she was asked about her freedom faith that could live out this dream. And I close with a reflection from Dr. Courtney Pace about what Dr. Hall had to say. She offered a beautiful elaboration of freedom faith. in response to questions about whether contemporary young people should be your board. Contemporary young people could build a movement to transform the nation, acknowledging the compounding oppressive forces targeting young Black people. Paul acknowledged, quote, "The world is on fire. This is a moment." Sit in any juvenile or family court and see our children burning up, burnt out at 15, offered up as sacrifice on the altar of the nation's ignorance, arrogance, and negligence. She continued, "We notice that the way the expert firefighters fight raging forest fires is by building fire. Freedom faith," she says, "is that fire already burning in the people." So I close with her quote, "I say to you, daughters and sons, it's in you. Every time you behold the world as it is and dare to dream of what it must become, that's the fire of freedom's faith. Every time you question jaded adults and tired leaders and say it's a new day and I don't feel no ways tired, that's the fire of freedom's faith. And every time you grab hold of the United States of America and like Israel, you dare wrestle and declare to it, we will not let you go until you bless us. That's the freedom, that's freedom faith's fire. It's in you, it's in us. Let us make America be America again in the interest of our children and for those whom we are called to serve. These are our boards who hold us accountable. This is the mission. This is the moment. These are the movements that call for empowered young people. Let us hear their muted and marginalized voices. Let's talk.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much. It's hard to even follow up after that amazing speech and inspiring and aspirational and calling us to do the work that we need to do for our communities and for our children. I know that we have many folks that have questions for you about this, about how we can do this work better, about how we can hear the voices, the muted and the marginalized, what we can do as advocates and as folks working in community. So I'm going to start with a question from Andrea Jacobs Rofail. And Andrea, I apologize if I just did something to your name and didn't pronounce it correctly. Dr. Wilson, what change do you want to see now and why for children in 2022? If you could leave us with one challenge or focus in our journey, what would that challenge or focus be?
Yeah, I focus on this concept of democracy. I truly do believe that child well-being, racial justice, and democracy are all intertwined. And I think democracy becomes the engine by which we get to our aspirations of child well-being and racial justice. So what I really call on child advocates and folks who are engaged in this children's rights space to do is to shift the accent mark. The children's rights movement has been marked internationally by three core elements. Provision, let's make sure children have what they need, things like the child tax credit, make sure that parents earn appropriate wages. Protection, let's keep negative things from happening for children, make sure that they're safe in their communities and in their homes. The lesser of the three that we focus on is participation. This idea that children have agency and authority over their own lives. Especially when we're talking about youth, right? So I'll say children and youth in this regard as we kind of, I remember, of course, some of us, it would be helpful to remind ourselves that adolescence is a creation from the last 50 years. So like this distinction of children and youth, right? We created that. So I say children and youth in this regard must participate in processes, and that's not just public ones. But that is also ones that should guide and guard the work that we are doing on their behalf, that we should be doing more work with children and youth than we are doing right now. We tend to do lots of work for children and youth. And I've got three children. I've got three young boys at home. Actually, they're not young. The oldest one will be 17 next week. I got a 17-year-old, a 13-year-old, and 12-year-old boy. I got a 6-year-old girl at home. And I'll tell you that I would, there are some adults who I would trade out of the voting age population for my 13 and my 17-year-old. So that's just, I think there's something about making sure we're listening to their voices. They are informed in ways that we had not been before. They should be driving a lot of the work. And I think structurally, I'd love to see more of them on our boards. Publicly, frankly, we've had this conversation at CDF. I'll tell you a quick secret real fast and I'll let it go. If I could do one thing right now and say, snap my fingers, I'd run a campaign to lower the voting age in America. I think it's the last time we saw a significant transformation in the electorate. We talk about Shirley Chisholm, what made possible her run, and it to be even something that we paid attention to, it's a lowering of the voting age. When we have young people who have more information, more capacity to process, and are more impacted by the decisions we're making in public policy, I think they should have voice. So I think opening democracy, the participation of young people, focusing on participation in children's rights and child advocacy work, and even this wider aspiration. If I can figure out a way to do it, then you'll see it soon. This idea that we should actually be thinking about lowering the voting age in America.
Love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. I'm just going to keep questions coming while we have time. And so I'm going to be peppering you with questions. In these days, when so many federal resources are being redirected to assist Ukraine, when conservatives are resisting any and all social investment, what policy changes do you suggest that we as advocates for children really focus on?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that we are focusing on, and we encourage you to be a part of the conversation. We've had a unique moment of at least, let's just say, evidence. We have 6 solid months, and we'll have a full year worth of very good evidence that an expanded child tax credit that mimics or has the marks of a monthly child allowance can work to provide sustainability and stability for families. I was gratified to hear the voices of some of the leaders on this call, including you, Michelle. Thank you, speaking out for at the point that Congress was still in a point of negotiation for the potential extension, to say that we needed the extension of the expanded child tax credit, because we remember and we recall, of course, that every English-speaking industrialized nation has something like a child allowance. And so CDF is pleased to work with the Center for Social Policy to lead a coalition of organizations across the country, hundreds of organizations across the country, for an automatic benefit for children. So I think this is still a long-term campaign that we need to be on. It's something we need to be fighting for on a regular basis. Right now, I encourage people that universal free school lunch is set to expire in June. This is a critical piece for young people, making sure they have access to nourishing meals, and frankly, reducing administrative burden from school districts and community organizations. They are able to serve more children at less cost because of these waivers. The USDA wants these waivers. Congress just needs to figure it out. Unfortunately, they were not in the president's budget proposal a couple of weeks ago. This is a critical piece that we need to be on right now. And I want to encourage people to prepare themselves, ramping up. Yes, indeed, the work that's happening around expanding childcare, investments in early education are critical. I really appreciate the frame that the president laid out a year ago this month, where he began to talk about lowering the age of public investment from K-12 to say on the lower side, we want to invest in young people as early as 3 years old, making access to universal pre-K critical as a part of our delivery to the next generation, but also expand and higher the age on the other side, investments in community colleges toward associate's degrees. We recognize that we are not economically competitive with the rest of the country and with the rest of the globe based on our investments in formative education. And so we need to expand from a K-12 frame, go down to at least a 3-14, 3 years old up to 14 frame. These are critical issues for us. We should not leave on the table the idea of prenatal to 3 investments in maternal health and wholeness of young people at that level either. So things like the Momnibus bill, I'm encouraging people across the country to look at, to focus on as a commitment, not only to early education of young people, but a commitment to racial equity as it focuses on and impacts Black mothers in a more critical way than some other legislation that we see coming forth right now. So those are things that I would suggest. And if I had to just swing for the fences and really kind of wanted to agitate some people, especially in a state with so many universities, I tell you that we have also endorsed universal free college. That this is something that we believe in the context of America. As we talk about caring for children and youth, as we talk about education. The original kind of focus of K-12 education was making sure we had an educated citizenry. As we talk about that over the course of term, we also think we need to be educating and focusing on things like making sure people have access to the remarkable universities like those all over the state of North Carolina.
Great, thank you so much. There's a couple questions in here, and then I'm looking at it elsewhere. Some texts that folks are sending me, just talking about how we can best shift our own mindset and in engaging youth. How do we do a better job of that, particularly when we talk about youth participation in organizations, in boards of directors, in commissions, in places where decisions get made about them, but they're often not part of that discussion. And if you have thoughts about how we can do that better.
Yeah, I really do believe in that phrase originated. I think the first origination is like 1505 in Poland and their government, but then really kind of came to the fore in the 1990s from South African disability rights advocates, nothing about me without me. I think that's a critical and helpful kind of a rallying cry, but I think we have to structure for it, right? I believe in people here at CDF get tired of hearing me saying these three words: strategy, structure, staffing. Like things go in that order. So if we have that kind of strategic commitment, the question then is how do we structure it in? What's the responsibility? I've shared a little bit of that today. I think our boards have to get younger. They just have to get younger, including ours as part of the work that we're doing at CDF. We need people who are engaging as young people, and we need to see people who engage young people on our boards, not just as grandchildren, but also children. So we actually need working parents in some of these boards, and some of our calculations for who should be on the board don't actually fit with these things. So that's one. Number two, I'll tell you the most significant change that I've made from a staffing standpoint in my first year at the Children's Defense Fund, and actually I did it within the first 8 months, is we stood up staffing around leadership development and organizing. So we had a commitment to that. We didn't have a structured staff team around it. And so the first grant I went to go get, the first ask I made that I wrote myself was for multi-year funding for community organizing and to beef up our capacity in that work. So I believe that advocacy organization, now I'm getting in everybody's business, but I'm gonna be off the call in a few minutes. Get everybody's business, then I'm gonna get off the call, right? I believe that we need community organizers where we have policy advocates. I don't believe, and I think those are two very different roles. I think they should be different jobs. And I think they should be at least equals within the organization. Because asking policy folks who are critical, valuable people to engage a different skill set around listening, right? There's a voice piece, there's a responsible voice, there's a learning, there's an analysis that has to come to the conversation, but there's also a grounding that has to come from being clear about what people need, right? The policy conversations, a report out of the University of Maryland not long ago that was based upon a conversation that happened at a Build Initiative convening for Ford Foundation. And the title of it was, "Why Are All the White People at the Policy Table?" And it was conversations and interviews of Black and Brown, primarily women, advocates in the early childhood space and the like, about kind of what they've come to wrestle with. And the fact that we largely set the agenda based upon needs of people who are not the ones who are dealing with the most pain. And it's good stuff, but I'll tell you, I talk about the child tax credit, I think it's valuable. But when I started doing Hill circulations last year, it was Black women on the Hill who told me, this isn't the top thing we need to talk about, right? So we had a good, earnest discussion. We talked about how even some of the frame and the messaging we needed to tweak about the value of it. But they said, look, I'm a Black mama, I'm a Black grandmama, and we got other problems. So let's talk about the fact that it's Black children who are disproportionately poor, and this is not Black mama's issue. So let's talk about what Black mamas need. And so that's what critical work that I've been researching and spending time on, and talking to scholars like Dr. Nadia Brown over at Georgetown to say, when Black women drive the policy conversation, when Black caregivers get to write the agenda, what does it look like and how is it different? And things like community violence pop up much sooner for them than they do for the normal table of child advocates that I see in Washington, D.C. So we've got to have an answer for that, right? We got to be wrestling with that in ways that we typically have not around the child advocacy space.
Great, thank you so much. This amazing. These are, I know, many of the things that folks on this webinar are really trying to think through. I know our agency is really trying to think through how do we make sure that the voices of those who are most impacted are part of the policy advocacy and policy making process, and how do we need to change as an agency to make that happen. And I know a lot of folks on this call are thinking through the same things. One of the, and I'm looking at our time, I think we have a couple more minutes. So marginalized communities, here's another question from LaMonica Mitchell. Marginalized communities often have a higher number of single parents. How can we support single parents more effectively? And I think interesting, Dr. Wilson, maybe from like a policy perspective, but also how can we support their participation and engagement and voice when they have so many pressures on them? What do we need to do differently so that we can support their participation and their voice?
Yeah, I think, there's some really basic things that I'm sure folks on this meeting are doing. And I say this as, someone who grew up with a mother who was PTA president for several rounds. She did at least 3 rounds as PTA president while she was working and raising me and my 4 siblings primarily by herself. So I'm raised by a single mom. Recognize that it was a different day as well. So all those things matter. But I think, being really thoughtful about how we structure these accountabilities and what do meetings look like. Again, strategy, structure, staffing. I say as a CEO, I can't say that I want to have community engagement and community organizers on my staff and make them work 9 to 5, and then know that they can only get to conversation with those parents after hours, right? So I actually have to think about flexibility, and these things seem odd, but I have to think about flexibility in my workday in order to allow for community engagement, which only can happen after hours. And I have to figure out how to resource that, right? In St. Louis, we built something called the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing. And we did it in order to resource community convenings and conversations of children and youth. Well, the thing we had to build that no one understood, we were like, oh, you're building a conference center. It's like, no, we're building a center for child wellbeing. You're building a conference center. No, we're building a center for child wellbeing. But what's the difference? Well, in the middle of the conference center, it was kind of built like a U, we built a children's room. And yeah, it could do all the other multifunction stuff, but it had to be a real children's room. Even though adults would primarily be convening, we should never have a meeting. I learned this at my church. I can't ever have a meeting of women at church. I can't ever have a Bible study. And by the way, Black church, I was a pastor for 10 years, Black church is run by women, period. I don't care who's in the pulpit. Black church is run by women, right? No matter what people believe, right? And so I can't have a church meeting that doesn't have childcare. And I know it seems odd, but we do it all the time. We have meetings of these advisory bodies and boards, and we have them in the middle of the day. So only people with a certain modicum of middle class access and control over their calendars can even come to our meetings. So we got to be meeting in the evenings. We got to be resourcing these meetings with support for early child education, with childcare. And we have to be orienting ourselves first and foremost to start. We got to slow down our process. Say this again. We got to slow down our processes to allow time for the community to engage. And we've got to resource that. If you need a way to make a case for this with your boards, because we got to make space for this stuff, Michelle, we got, you don't have to do this, I have to make a case to the board. And so the TCC group, a social impact kind of consultancy, has a couple of resources on what they call relational capacity. So it's about how an organization is strengthened by having feedback loops, investing in communications, being responsive to and having systems to be responsive to communities that it says it serves. And it's really helpful for making the case to funders. I say this as a former funder. Funders look at capacity and say, well, how large is your budget and who's on your board? No. Ability to move with and to move people that I say I serve is a critical capacity. And TCC Group and their work on relational capacity, which you can Google, I think it's helpful and healthy for not only assessing that, but also being kind of diagnostic in how we invest in building that for our institutions.
Great, thank you so much. And yes, we do have to make the case to our boards and to our funders. This is a different way of operating, and I think the slow down and it takes more time in a environment of like urgent crisis. We got to get this done is something that we're all trying to figure out and balance. And thank you for your thoughts on that. I have another question. I think we have a few minutes. And this is from Rachel Radford, who is a member of NC Child's Parent Advisory Committee. She writes, Dr. Wilson, I'm a mother of 2 autistic sons who I am raising to be advocates like their mom. And Rachel's a great advocate, I know from personal experience. Do you feel that children as young as 8 and 11 years old have a voice in society? How can they best speak up for what matters to them? And thank you for all you do. And it's an honor to hear you speak.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be in conversation with you, Rachel. I saw your question down in the chat, so I'm really glad to get a chance to answer it. Yes, I think these young people have voice. One of the things, I'm a preacher, right? And so one of the things I think about is the theologies that start with children's voices. What do they think of? Do kids have a concept of God? Like that's a thing for me as a pastor, and I think they do. They have an idea about who God is, what God does, and I think they also have a sense of what safety feels like. It was, I forget the name of the scholar from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, but he does work around child well-being. He says one of the first indicators of children's capacity to be well is their experience of violence, whether they feel safe in their home and in their neighborhood. And I think children have a sense of that. Now, how we get at it, I think we've got some work to do to get into conversations with them, to hear what their aspirations are, what their hopes are, and what their challenges are. And then we've got to do some interpretive work without erasing their voice, right? But they absolutely have voice in that. I was really excited to see in the State of the Union this year, there was a young man who was, I think, 11 years old at the time, who President Biden pointed to up in the rafters and kind of shined a light on him. Who's wrestled with some health challenges. But that young man, after having done some work, I realized he had been advocating since he was 6 years old in the Virginia legislature for access in schools for young people with challenges like he had, right? So I think, yes, Rachel, I think it is, you are positioning your children well, and you listening and being a voice with them is absolutely critical. And I think our organizations can do some interpretive work to help to get at that as well. So yes, we need to be doing listening sessions. I'm excited to be doing some listening sessions across the country this year. We need to be doing some lab work on this kind of theology work that I'm talking about. I've got some labs that'll be going at a conference we're having this summer to really wrestle with what we hear in children's voices and have, people with the degrees, make the people with the degrees interpret, but the raw data should come directly from young people. And young people absolutely have voice. There was a point in the draft of this speech where I was going to suggest to you all, because movements can change our priorities and muted voices from time to time. The last thing you really want is teenagers correcting you in public. I'm old school in this regard. I don't want my sons, getting me right and getting me together in public. But that's what happened in St. Louis. When we were going about our business around this beautiful Cradle to Career initiative, and young people decided, no, we're going to talk about criminal justice. They just gathered us up. As young people say, they gathered us, got us together and said, no, this is the conversation we're going to have. And young people have a capacity for gathering us up. And I think that's really important from our advocacy space as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. This has been amazing, incredible, powerful. I'm teary listening to you. I'm inspired, and so thank you so much for being such a voice for our children, for our communities, for the marginalized and the muted voices who need us and need you to help support their engagement and their participation and everybody being able to sort of see their power as we try to create a better America, a better North Carolina for our kids and for our families. So thank you so much for being here today. We are honored and we are inspired.
God bless you, Michelle. Thank you for the work you're doing to pull together this group is absolutely powerful. I look forward to learning more. I'm telling you, I'm coming to North Carolina more than I'm going anywhere else this year. So I want to be learning. I want to be figuring out how we can be helpful and supportive to what you all are doing and how we need to shift some of the work we're doing in the state with our freedom schools and the like. So this won't be the last time. And I want to be in a place to be in a listening posture more. So thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you to all of you who are here. I appreciate the time with you today.
Great. Thank you so much. And we are glad to see you back in Durham. We're going to hold you to that promise of being able to engage with you again and some more. Couple quick things as we're wrapping this up. First, thanks for everyone for being here. Please join us back here at 11. So in just a little bit for a panel of incredible community leaders who are centering racial equity in their work. You'll find the link for that session in your digital program. And then at 4 o'clock this afternoon, we're going to try to get all 500 of you, that's how many folks are signed up, connecting with each other for a really fun virtual social hour. So please don't miss it, but please be back here at 11 for our next panel. Thank you for participating. Thank you for all the work you do. We are really eager to have some more discussion with you. So see you back here at 11. Thanks, everybody.